Hey. All right, we're rolling. We're waiting for this one to go up. Good morning, everybody. Please come in. There are more seats here. Feel free to. It's fully booked, so we have to be close friends today, this morning, and sit close together. My name is Karsten Friis. I work here at NUPI as the head of our Security and Defense Research Group. This morning, the Parliament in Norway, we're going to discuss how to protect better the physical infrastructure of the police and the military and other installations. I would maybe describe that as the security challenge of the 20th century. Right? It's a building fortresses, building walls against physical attacks. We today are going to talk about the 21st century security challenges, the digital infrastructure that keeps our society going. The digital backbone of our societies, which carries water, electricity, transportation, basically anything you can think of, is the networked and online and carried by digital frameworks. I hope the Parliament will one day discuss these issues as well, because it's much more important for national security than what we're going to discuss today. And we have seen, of course, before the parliamentarians are very good at double tasking, so maybe they're looking at this event streaming on live as well. Let's hope so. We are extremely fortunate this morning to have Michael Chertoff with us, who's the former Secretary of US Homeland Defense in the US. And he has been working with US cybersecurity strategy. Since leaving office, he has been putting up his own Chertoff Group, and I've had the pleasure of listening to him several times in Globsec and other international events. I know he's a great speaker. I really knows his stuff, both from his background as a public servant, but also from the later years working specifically on cybersecurity. I will not take any more of your time. I will just remind you again that this event is being streamed live. And I also like to use the opportunity to thank the US Embassy for co-organizing this event with us. It's really a pleasure for us. Mr. Chertoff, you will speak for about half an hour. Then we'll open for Q&A. So prepare your questions as he speaks, and I will make sure most of you at least, hopefully, will be able to answer questions. So, sure, sir, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you for hosting me, and I was able to arrive yesterday and enjoy some spectacular weather, which I appreciated as an opportunity to get acquainted with Oslo. Before I begin on cybersecurity, let me just briefly digress to make an observation. As you probably read, Senator John McCain passed away over the weekend. He was an American hero. I had the privilege of working with him when I was Secretary of Homeland Security and staying in touch with him after. And going back to his days when he was in the Navy and shot down in Vietnam, up until literally the moment he drew his last breath, he was a consummate public servant. Many of you probably have heard the story that when he was in a Vietnamese prison camp, he was offered the opportunity to leave early, because his father was the commander of the Pacific Fleet for the U.S. Navy. And he refused to leave because he felt that would betray his comradeship with his fellow soldiers and would look as if it was an effort to take advantage of his father's status. That is the embodiment of honor. And in a day in which there's a lot of skepticism about institutions and norms, reminding ourselves what honor and norms are about is sometimes very refreshing. So, my condolences to his family. He will really be sorely missed. So, let me step back and, again, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this issue, which has been very much in the news, not just in the U.S., but around the world. If I step back to when I was in office in the early part of this century, we were aware of cyber threats, but most of what people were thinking about were activities by criminals, stealing credit cards, things of that sort. That's bad, but it is generally considered to be a police matter. There was also, however, the increasing use of cyber for espionage purposes. And as the years went by, it became evident that cyber was not just being used for national security espionage, but for commercial espionage, particularly the Chinese, were taking huge amounts of trade secrets and confidential business data and turning it over to their own enterprises, which became the subject of increasing complaints in the United States and elsewhere about the inappropriateness of using organs of national security to gain business advantages. One of the interesting things to realize is that one of the reasons cyber became very useful for this kind of information gathering was the development of a series of additional tools in the analytics space and in the storage space that all of a sudden made it possible to use large amounts of data in a way that wouldn't have been the case earlier. And I'll give you an example. A couple of years ago, the Office of Management and Budget, the Office of Personnel Management in the United States, which houses all of the background checks for every single U.S. government employee and applicant, over 25 million, discovered that they'd been hacked and literally all of the files had been sucked out. And obviously, there was an intelligence purpose in doing that, in building a database of Americans. Now, 20 years ago, even if you could have gotten that, it would have been pointless, because who's going to spend the time necessary to go through 25 million files? But nowadays, with the development of storage and analytics, it is possible to go through that and pick out what you want very rapidly. So the enhancement of cyber as a tool of espionage was partly an outgrowth of the development of analytical tools and storage capacity, which made it realistic for the first time to digest and make use of petabytes and terabytes of data. But more recently, I think people in the national security area have viewed the issue as not just a matter of theft of intellectual property or data, but the possibility of using cyber as a domain of warfare to complement, in what we sometimes call blended warfare, activities that occur on the ground, at sea, and in the air. We've seen examples of this through what is sometimes called hybrid warfare, largely not very far from here along the Russian border. And what the Russians have done, this goes back to 2007, when Estonia was attacked with a denial of service attack because there was anger in Russia about the pulling down or the movement of a war memorial. 2008, the invasion of Georgia, the physical invasion was accompanied by an attack on the command and control systems. So we've seen for the last 10 years this move into the domain of being yet another element of physical warfare. Even more recently, though, the destructive capacity of cyber attacks, even on a standalone basis, has become manifest. And right in our backyard here is a case in point, if you think of Maersk and what happened with the NotPetya ransomware very, very recently. As you may know, NotPetya was an exploit that took advantage of a vulnerability in a version of Windows. It was embedded in an accounting software package that was developed in the Ukraine, kind of like a TurboTax or an accounting program like Quicken. And then it rapidly spread, not just in the Ukraine, but around the world, partly because in the case of Maersk, for example, they had an office in the Ukraine that was using that software package. Once the malware got into that, it spread virally across all of the network. And that's one of the interesting expressions when we talk about things spreading virally, because in many ways, when you look at these kinds of attacks, you have to think about it the way you would consider an epidemic or even a biological weapon, something that is not necessarily well controlled. That once it's released into the wild, the possibility of it getting out and collaterally damaging other things becomes a very high risk. It's hardly a precision weapon in many cases. And one of the consequences of that is often the impact is much wider than maybe originally anticipated, and you can debate whether the Russians who attacked using NotPetya intended it to be confined to the Ukraine or wanted to send a message to anybody who did business with the Ukraine. But it also has some interesting international law issues about what your obligation is to not engage in warfare against civilians when you're using a weapon that is almost by definition indiscriminate. It's not the only time the Ukraine has experienced a direct cyber attack. In 2015 and 2016, around Christmas time, the lights went out in the electric grid because there were attacks on the controlling systems in that grid. And in the U.S., relatively recently, the Department of Homeland Security put out a bulletin, not only indicating that they had found malware on the electric grid in the United States, but that the Russians had placed the malware there. They were able to tie it back to the Russians and were willing to publicly identify it as a Russian exploit. Now, as you know, when you're dealing with malware, you're never quite sure, is this there for reconnaissance or is it pre-positioning a weapon? And the answer may well be it's unclear. That once the malware is in the network, depending on the instructions it gets, it can either simply send back information or it can do something more damaging. But what is clear is we're talking about the locating of potentially destructive weapons in critical civilian infrastructure in various places in the world. And that, of course, is a matter of great concern in the U.S., and I think it's probably becoming a greater concern here as well. I would also be remiss if I didn't say, and I should say I co-chair a commission with Anders Rasmussen on this issue. Our elections are now potentially coming under attack. The possibility of affecting voter databases or other parts of the infrastructure is of increasing concern. There again in the Ukraine, several years ago, there was an attack not directly on the voting infrastructure, but on the reporting infrastructure that the media was using to report on the presidential election. And the theory was that the results that would be announced initially would incorrectly name the pro-Russian candidate as having won. The attackers presumably knew in the end the truth would come out, but they thought that by creating that uncertainty, they would actually undermine confidence in the election result. If that sounds familiar, I don't need to say anything more. So how do we deal with this issue? Because this is a real challenge and presents some complications that are not normally to be found in the national security area. Simply put, most of the assets of critical infrastructure are in private hands. Unlike the airspace, for example, which is basically controlled by the government. So if you have a bomber or a missile coming into our airspace in the U.S., it's going to be the responsibility of the Air Force to deal with that issue. It's also going to be quite clear where it's coming from because we're going to see where it launched or where it took off. That is not true, as you know, in the world of cyber. An attack can be launched from anywhere, within and without, and it's not necessarily going to be evident initially who launched it. There is basically no perimeter in cyberspace. So we have insiders sometimes launching attacks. We have, even for air-gapped systems, USB sticks coming with malware can be inserted into the system. You can have somebody sitting in a coffee shop in downtown Austin, Texas, who can use the Wi-Fi there to launch an attack, and it would appear as if it was coming from within the United States. So this creates the question of how do we work together in the public and the private sector to maximize our ability to protect our national security assets. Now, the U.S. government has evolved several iterations of how to deal with this, and I'm not going to tell you this is done by any means. When I was in office, there was a national cybersecurity strategy that we put together at the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Defense that was the first effort to try to pull together a comprehensive strategy on how to deal with cyber attacks. And that included all kinds of things about allocating responsibilities, trying to get some understanding of what our doctrine would be about responding to an attack, and a series of similar kinds of issues. It was originally classified, but it was subsequently declassified in the Obama administration. Part of what we did was we set up information sharing and analysis centers, which were designed to bring together within each of the kind of major categories of economic activity, the major elements of the private sector and the public sector to share information and best practices on how to deal with cyber threats and cyber response. But I have to say, these are not real-time organizations. In other words, they're not working at machine speed. They're more addressed at the kind of policy level or operational level strategically. It's not something's coming, how do we immediately react? The next iteration of trying to actually get more tactical was the NCIC, the National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center. That is in the Department of Homeland Security, and it houses what is supposed to be the principal mechanism for warning the private sector when something's coming at them and sharing information about how you might blunt that. It is also the organization affiliated with the CERT, Computer Emergency Response Team, which helps the private sector with response. Even there, though, you're only as good as the amount of information you get. And although there's always the hope that the private sector will share information in real time or close to real time, it doesn't always happen. There are legal reasons why there may be reluctance. There are sometimes the fact that the private sector doesn't see something happening. Sometimes, again, because we're not literally linked in a network, that may slow up the process of sharing. Even more recently, this past summer, the Department of Homeland Security announced a National Risk Management Center, which is going to try to look with the private sector at putting together a list of the key assets and the key things that need to be protected to make sure that we don't have a serious, devastating cybersecurity incident. So these efforts to pull together centers, sharing environments, and things like this are part of the process of getting the public and the private sector to work together. One of the things which we talked about doing when I was in office, and I think is now actually being pursued, is actually trying to co-locate and bring together elements of the private sector, particularly the financial community, in with the government in the actual operations center, security operations center, so that there can be a sharing not only of what's happening in real time, but an understanding on the part of the government what the private sector views as the most vulnerable and most consequential areas that might come under attack. Because the government doesn't necessarily always understand where the real weak point is and how from an integrated system standpoint, what might be the fulcrum of what would be a very devastating attack. Now, as I said, we're on a journey. We are not completed. And the reason is because there are some obstacles to working with the public and the private sector together. One of them, which is an issue for us, I don't know if it is here, is the issue of clearances. It is often the case that information you get about an attack, where it's coming from, what it looks like, what the particular type of malware or exploit is, comes in a way that is very sensitive. And therefore, if you're not cleared, you may not be able to see much about what that is. And I'll be honest and say that sometimes the people on the information collection side of the spectrum get extremely sensitive about anything that they imagine might tip off somebody that they're doing something that's collecting information. On the other hand, the people who were responsible for making use of the information say, well, if we can't use it, what are you getting it for? So balancing this and making sure we can clear more people and get them in a position where they can actually be informed, I think is one task. I think the private sector, in terms of its own sharing, still labors with liability and reputational concerns. The fear is if they share information, they may be held liable for violating privacy. And I know there's some issues of privacy here in Europe, which we don't have in the US. But even in the US, there's a concern about reputational damage or liability if someone winds up getting sued. And so the lawyers wind up trying to slow things up. There again, I think our solution is to try to create legal safe harbors that allow for sharing, and as long as it's done in good faith, insulate you from being sued later because you violated somebody's privacy. So again, that's a work in progress. Another challenge for the private sector is how do they know how much to invest? I mean, in my day job, a lot of what I do when I work with companies is to try to give them guidance because they're inundated with, quote, solutions for cyber attacks. And every solution claims it's going to solve the problem. I find most of them are new companies which usually have the word blue and fire somewhere in the name. And nobody can tell the difference. You could bankrupt yourself buying this stuff. So a lot of the challenge is getting companies to understand what do they need to buy, what is out there that fits their particular needs, and then to create a financial incentive. Will they get a lower premium with their insurance? We have something in the U.S. called the Safety Act, which in the case of counterterrorism technologies says that if you have an government-approved technology for counterterrorism, then if you use it and it turns out that notwithstanding the technology there was a terrorist attack, you get liability protection in terms of a cap on damages and no punitive damages. So that means for the business executive or the business owner, they can say, okay, if I invest this in the technology, I'm going to get actually a financial benefit. And that's an incentive. And I'd like to see us move that into the area of cyber as well, because that would encourage investment. So let me step back and say, then, what do we, in an ideal world or close to ideal world, view as the role the public and the private sector ought to play together in dealing with cybersecurity? And I will begin by saying I do not think it is ever going to be entirely a government responsibility, because the only way the government could be responsible would be to live on all of your networks. And that would not be, there are countries in the world that would love to do that. My country is not one of them. I don't think yours is either. So the question is, what is the right allocation of responsibilities between the public and the private sector? And before I lay that out, let me talk about the whole issue of cybersecurity as a spectrum. It is, in the world of counterterrorism, there's the expression left of boom, right of boom. Left of boom is how do you stop an explosion, right of boom is what do you do after an attack. There's a similar concept in cybersecurity. You have to begin by saying, what are the threats? Who's out there and what are they trying to do? Then what are the vulnerabilities? What are the elements of your network that are vulnerable? And then as you start to look at your various solutions, how do you protect your perimeter? How do you deal with the endpoints when they're not inside your perimeter, because everybody brings their own device to the network these days? How do you deal with the issue of identification and privileges and access to parts of the network? How do you monitor in real time what's going on in the network so that when you're penetrated, as you will inevitably be, you can determine that something is in there and you can take action to remediate it? What is your plan to be resilient in terms of backups, in terms of able to recover, in terms of being able to work around a problem? Then there is a supply chain issue. What about all the people that you're dealing with that are affecting your network? Your hardware supplier, your software supplier, the heating and cooling technician who came in to check your air conditioning like they did at Target up in Minnesota, and that there was malware on the guy's computer, and when he plugged into Target, the malware went into Target. And then what is your response? How do you deal in response once you've discovered an attack? In that spectrum, the private sector plays the major role, but the government can do different things. So let me give you some examples of what the government can do. On the issue of threat, and this comes back to the point I made earlier, there are times the government can understand what is in the adversary's toolbox before the tool has been taken out and used. And although that gets sensitive because for obvious reasons, if you are able to get into the adversary's toolbox, you don't want the adversary to know it or they'll close it. But sometimes you need to make a decision that it's more important to warn about what might be coming, even if it puts some risk in terms of your collection capability. This is a version of what occurred during World War II when, as many of you may remember, or know, having read, I read about it, Churchill at one point got information because of the breaking of the German military code about an attack on the city of Coventry. And he had to decide, was he going to warn about the attack and then the Germans would realize the code was broken, or would he not say anything? He decided he wasn't going to say anything. And that might well have been the right decision. But that's what I call a Coventry decision, and you have to make that all the time. Next, on vulnerability, the government often is aware of vulnerabilities, as are people in the private sector, that are undisclosed. In the US, we have a process called the vulnerability equity process. And what it's designed to do is to ask the question, is this a vulnerability we should disclose to the software designer or the hardware designer so they can fix it? Or is it something that we need to use in order to penetrate the adversary? And generally the view, and I'm on something called the Global Commission on Stability in Cyberspace. Generally the view is that the presumption ought to be in favor of disclosing widespread vulnerabilities, because that can have a major impact on all of our citizens. And even if it means we trade off the ability to exploit it ourselves, the balance ought to be in favor of protecting our citizens. Now, obviously, if you're dealing with a vulnerability that's very narrowly tailored to a particular device that, let's say, hypothetically is going to the dictator of North Korea, you might want to be quiet about that. But on broad range vulnerabilities, the government does have a role in disclosing those when they're discovered. On issues like perimeter, privileged access, endpoint security, and continuous diagnosis and monitoring, here, these are within the network. And the government is not going to simply sit there and look at what's in your network absent being asked to do so. So here, the government probably can best give information about best practices, about the nature of malware that's been detected, about things that need to be patched. But the laboring oar is likely to be on the private sector in terms of actually carrying out these functions. On the issue of supply chain, there's an interesting discussion now taking place about, well, how do you help companies understand whether the hardware and software they're getting is vulnerable or not? And how do you even let ordinary citizens know? Now, we're getting to the so-called Internet of Things, where your refrigerator is going to be smart, and your camera and your doorbell. I don't know if you have that here in Norway, but you have like literally, you can set your locks from remotely on the internet, and you can look through your doorbell. All this generates data. And once you are connected up to the network, if that's not secure, your entire network can be compromised. Case in point, some years back, the Chamber of Commerce in the US in Washington was hacked because there was a thermostat in a remote building that was unsecured. It was penetrated and it connected to the network, and they got into the Chamber of Commerce. Right now, there is no requirement that these Internet of Things devices even have the minimal ability to change password, make sure you're updating, and patch vulnerabilities. Does that need to change? Does the government need now to get involved in either regulating or at least certifying those kinds of smart devices that are reliable and those that are not reliable? Some say the government ought to use its acquisition authority when it buys things to insist on a certain level of security, and that will start to drive behavior in the private sector, which will benefit everybody. So I think there's some interesting policy discussions to be had about how do you raise even the base level of security on all of the components that come into our, not just our critical systems, but our daily, everyday systems. And in this I would underscore for the policymakers, what happens over here doesn't stay over here. Even the most innocuous, trivial, connected thing, if it's part of the network, is going to wind up infecting the network. And Maersk is a great example, because you see what happens with the accounting software package, and it spreads throughout the entire network. So there needs to be an understanding this is truly a case where the weakest link affects the entire chain. Finally, we get to the issue of response. When there is a serious incident, what can the government do to respond? And there I think we have made a lot of progress. We do have these computer emergency response teams that do work with the private sector when there's an issue in helping them get back up again. We actually deployed a team like that to Estonia in 2007 to help them to recover from their situation. And in the US, we have written a national response framework for cybersecurity that lays out the roles and responsibilities of the various government agencies and the private sector when it comes to responding to a major incident. Now, we haven't yet had that major incident, so this is not necessarily road tested under realistic conditions, but at least it's a good starting point in terms of allocating responsibilities in the event of an attack, and I think you can probably get it on the internet. Finally, let me turn to 3 other sets of activities that are relevant to cybersecurity where the government actually plays the major role and the private sector supports. One is the issue of botnet takedowns. When you have these massive botnets or you have servers that are launching large amounts of malware, increasingly the effort is being made to take them down and get them off the internet. And that's an issue where the government, at least in the US, you need to get court permission in order to do certain things because it would violate the law for the private sector to do it on its own. But once you have the court permission or legal permission, then the private sector works with the government to take down the botnet. Another area where the government has primary, if not sole responsibility, is what is sometimes called active defense, but is really probably more in the nature of offense. There's a debate in the US about so-called hacking back. Hacking back is someone steals your data or you want to go and get it back. So you want to go into their server and get the data back and maybe purge their server of the data. That's a little bit like someone robs my house. At least in the US, I don't have the permission to go into their house and get my stuff back. I understand the impulse to do this, but I think there are all kinds of problems with the private sector doing this on its own. First of all, as you know, most of the time the attack does not come directly. It goes through various hop points. The potential for hurting innocent people or taking down an innocent server is very high with very serious consequences. For the private sector to do this on its own would also break the law, at least in the US. And you could also wind up escalating into a situation where what was a serious but not devastating infraction suddenly became an actual conflict. So my view, although they'll get different views on this, but my view is if there's going to be hacking back in someone else's network, it's a US government function. You know, the government decides if it's going to engage in active operations in someone else's network. Just like in the physical world, the government controls that. It's not, we don't let the private sector decide they're going to drop a bomb somewhere. It's a government decision if we're going to engage in military activity. And that leads me to the final area where I think the government has probably exclusive responsibility, and that is in developing a doctrine of deterrence. And there's a lot of debate about this now. After the nuclear age was born in the 50s, there was a project called Project Solarium. And this was an effort to come up with a doctrine of warfare in the nuclear age. We take for granted the fact that there's a very strong taboo, although it may be changing, against using nuclear weapons in any case other than if you literally had, like, mutually assured destruction. In other words, we don't use nuclear weapons as a kind of an alternative to an ordinary bomb or missile because we recognize once you start using a nuclear weapon, the stopping point is not clear. So there is no such thing as a kind of a localized nuclear weapon. Now, we've never officially said we'll never do it, but if you actually look at the history of both Russian and U.S. activities and Chinese activities, even when things have gotten a little heated in various conflicts, no one has used a nuclear weapon. In the Middle East, we've come close a couple of times, but again, there's been that taboo. This was by no means clear at the beginning. I mean, if you go back in the 50s, there were people who thought, hey, nuclear weapons, it's like TNT. Use it in the Korean War, use it freely. But ultimately, the decision was made that the inability to stage escalation made that a strategy to be avoided. We need a similar project with cyber. What constitutes an active war in cyber? We are too prone, I find, to use the phrase warfare as a metaphor for all kinds of things that are bad, but they're not really warfare. And the danger with that is, once you say something's warfare, all of a sudden there are a whole set of tools you may use that you wouldn't be able to use otherwise. So we need to really understand what is warfare. I mean, I think the U.S. is pretty clear that if you took down the air traffic control system and planes crashed and people died, kind of like a cyber 9/11, that would be regarded as an act of war. But for example, when you threaten, when you steal secrets, for example, as spies have done since the days of the Bible, when Joshua sent spies into Canaan, we don't go to war. We generally complain, we'll kick a few diplomats out, but we don't launch, an attack because someone stole our stuff. We need to have an understanding of what the red lines are and what the doctrine of escalation is. And that's something the governments are going to have to do. And I know that in NATO, they're working on this with the cyber center, and in the U.S. as well. So that's my kind of sense of what the response is. It's a blended response. In some areas, the private sector takes the lead and the government supports. In some, they have separate domains, and in some, the government takes the lead and the private sector either plays no role or supports. But one thing I will tell you is this problem is not going away. And the escalation of serious attacks with real-world consequences in the physical world, the tempo has picked up. And I'm sad to say that if you want to look at a test bed or a petri dish, look at the Ukraine, because everything that's being done there is something that can be done elsewhere. And unfortunately for the Ukrainians, they're the test tube in which the Russians are operating with their various kinds of tactics and techniques. So with that, I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you. Thank you for an excellent overview and pointing out to the challenges. I'm sure we recognize many of the challenges also here in Norway. But before I would like to start off with one question. Like in Norway, we have something called the Security Act, and critical infrastructure under the Security Act has specific requirements for protection. Some is inside it, some is not, and it's a bit arbitrary what is what or not. I wonder in the U.S. is there similar kind of legal distinction between different kind of?
There is. We have the Department of Homeland Security has certain authorities with respect to critical infrastructure. The details tend to be fleshed out more as a regulatory matter, not necessarily written in the statute. The challenge becomes defining what is critical infrastructure. Maybe not surprisingly, a lot of enterprises prefer not to be called critical infrastructure because it puts more obligation on them. For example, a couple of years ago, we had a meeting with Jay Johnson, who was one of my successors, right before the 2016 election. And he raised the issue about elections being critical infrastructure. And he ultimately put out a statement or not exactly a regulation, but a pronouncement that it was. And he got a lot of pushback from the state secretaries of state who run the elections because they thought, oh no, we're going to have to spend money and do stuff. And so they resisted. Now that's changed a little bit and they're coming around more. But we get a lot of resistance. Some enterprises know. I mean, it's not rocket science to figure out that if you run a water plant or an electric utility, you're going to be critical infrastructure. At the margin, some of them try to, kind of evade it.
Because there are lots of, let's say, hospitals,
Yeah.
which maybe not infrastructure, but if they are attacked like the experience in Norway, I mean, it has huge implications. So
Yeah.
it's a difficult process. Now, another question is that you talked about what the public sector can do with the certs to assist and other things. What we experience in Norway is often that typical private sector, especially the telecommunications, are actually the first line defenders.
Yeah.
They're the ones that discover things, and they're the first to respond, and maybe they even have more capacity to respond than the public sector, at least in small countries like Norway. How is that in the US? Is that also kind of a challenge, if you like, that the actually private sector are the first ones to detect, and they might not even share it with the public sector?
I mean, that's very true. I mean, the most likely to feel the impact is going to be the private sector. And certainly the telecoms and the major IS internet service providers do have some capabilities. But the government also has some unique capabilities, and getting them involved is usually something that's going to be helpful. I've had the experience when after I'd left government, we started our firm, a very well-known enterprise in the tech area, which I won't mention, contacted us because they'd been hacked and been penetrated, and they didn't want to tell the government because they thought, well, we're better than the government. We don't need government help. And I said, no, you're really not. You may think you are, but you don't know what the government can do. And so they ultimately didn't, and it was helpful. So, but I do think, again, the private sector does bring a lot to the table on this. And this is really a team sport. So if you can get the government and the private sector into it, you get the best collective knowledge.
Absolutely. Now, we recognize many of the challenges. We will open up for questions, for Q&As, and please state your name and affiliation. There's a microphone there, right behind you, the gentleman in the back there. Please stand up so we can see you and say who you are and quick question.
Good morning. My name, is this thing on? Good morning, my name is Vincent Baugh, and I'm Republicans Abroad, Norway. Listening to you, I hear a lot about government influence and government rule of cybersecurity, which I find a little unusual because I'm a little surprised to find the government so deep into this. Is there room for, development, or do you, I don't want to say poach, but do you get your information from government activity or basically by monitoring business? I don't understand exactly how you seem to have a lot of knowledge about systems and stuff like that, and I recognize who you are. But your collection, how do you get that? How do you know so much about cybersecurity to the degree that you can counsel business on that? How is that possible? What is your collection?
I mean, it's working with businesses. I probably have learned more about what goes on from my work in the private sector than I learned when I was in the government. Now, bear in mind, I left in 2009, and the government's engagement with this has grown quite a bit. But this is really a case. First of all, if you look at the government, much of the technical work is often done with contractors in the private sector because the government couldn't possibly hire enough people who are very sophisticated engineers, and they frankly can't pay them as well as the private sector. So, I mean, even the government tends to get a lot of information from people who are working for contractors. But the reality is, I think, a lot of this has gotten reported more recently in public. If you work in the private sector, you do, unfortunately, experience as a bitter but an effective teacher. You do learn a lot from that. And in many ways, I think the private sector has probably provided more information. But what you have seen a little bit lately is the government's been a little more forthcoming about what they know adversaries are doing. And frankly, some of the companies that do the cybersecurity forensic work have been publishing reports. So, for example, Mandiant published a report a few years ago on a PLA unit out of China that was hacking into all kinds of things, and they were quite specific. CrowdStrike, after the DNC hack, published information about Cozy Bear and Fancy Bear, these two groups of Russian hackers. One's with the SVR and one's the GRU. And that's been a great public service because the government would never have gotten into that level of detail, but the private sector can because it's not classified, and that helps people understand more about what are the tactics and techniques that they're facing.
Now, here in Europe, you're kind of used to the idea that Big Brother and the government kind of takes its part. It's a little bit surprising. It's a little bit surprising to hear you speak in the same manner that they do, where the government tends to not really run things, but to be over-involved in things.
Actually, I tell you, the complaint I've most often heard, at least in what I do, is the reverse. Why can't the government take care of this? We hire the government to provide police and the military to protect us against attacks. Why isn't the government protecting us against the Russians or criminal organizations or things of that sort? And the answer is that, for the reasons I've said, the government really can't because we don't want the government living in the network. So the question is, what is the role the government can play? And then how do you help the private sector protect itself?
Okay, we have to open for other questions. Thank you, Vincent. Kowalski in the first row here, Professor. Be a little bit patient to get the microphone. There you go.
Good morning. Stuart Kowalski, Professor NTNU Jurvik. Thank you very much for a very enlightening presentation. There was a lot on the private sector. I represent the academic sector and the role we have to play in this.
The most important sector, of course.
The cheapest sector, actually. We're the lowest paid, in any case. I have two questions. One is, what do you see as the role? I mean, you keep talking about private companies, but in many cases, if you're going to get objectivity, by definition, we're supposed to be objective. So what do you see as the role of the academic sector? And then I have a second question.
There are two things. One, I think education, teaching people, because the sad thing is this. It's one thing if someone hacks you because they've reached into some arcane tool in the toolbox. It's another thing if you left your door unlocked and wide open and people came in and took your stuff. The two biggest attack vectors are people click on things they shouldn't click on and they get phished and they get malware into the system. Or they take a USB stick they got and they stick it into the laptop and it infects the network. And that happened a few years back with the U.S. government. They did an experiment a few years ago where they put USB sticks on the floor of a garage and like 50% of them people stuck into their machines. And I'd say to people, oh, look, there's a hamburger on the floor. Why don't you just pick it up and put it in your mouth? People are like, of course not. Well, why would you stick it into your port? Another favorite of mine is like at the hotel. Oh, we have Wi-Fi. No, you don't even need a password. I don't think so. So there's basic education. The second area I think would be helpful would be attribution. Attribution is a very complicated issue. And I do think that there is room for some academic work in the area of helping us understanding what's a reasonable level of certainty and then how do we get there.
The second question is more related to the current national strategy signed by Trump in December 1917. I read the current strategy. It's the mantra is peace through strength. And it was one thing that I saw missing as coming from a small nation, etc., about this is that you mentioned in your speech about biological weapons, and in this case, chemical weapons, we have that. And what we have done in the world, we have these international conventions on how to deal with this. When I read your national security strategy today, I see no indication that you want to support an international convention. It seems that you want to go on your own. And how would you like to comment on that, the need to get more international conventions? So we need peace through knowledge and intelligence and diplomacy, not through strength. And how is the United States going to change that?
Yeah, so I think it's a very well taken point. So let me say two things. I mentioned a moment ago, I'm one of the co-chairs of this Global Commission on Stability in Cyberspace. Marina Kalyaran used to be the Foreign Minister of Estonia, is the chair, and we've got a bunch of folks, and we're working on exactly this issue. What are a set of norms to govern cyberspace? So, for example, we've put out a suggested norm on not attacking the public core of the internet, not taking steps that would undermine the general availability and integrity of the internet. So I do think that this is an area for international law and international cooperation, recognizing that, it's one thing to have the rules, another thing to have people abide by them. It doesn't mean you don't have the rules, but it means you have to have an understanding of what's realistic. A second challenge is some of the things I think we can reach agreement on, some we're not. I know from having dealt with people in Russia and China at a senior level, they have some very different ideas about what cybersecurity is. And we're not, for example, in the West, I think, going to agree that we're going to censor information that's viewed as antagonistic, because that would be run into the problem of protecting free speech. But there are some things I do think we could reach agreement on. One of the areas I've been working on is financial services. Should the financial system itself, again, integrity and availability, should that be protected? Where the government is, the fellow who used to be the cyber advisor in the White House under Donald Trump, who left a couple months ago, I think he believed in it. They did believe in international cooperation. They wanted to start with like-minded nations and kind of build out from there. So, working with countries in Europe, other kind of free countries that more or less have the same set of values, and try to come up with some agreements, and then over time see if that could spread. So, although the current president has been pretty open about his disdain for multilateral agreements, the reality is I think most of the people operationally involved in this area understand you have to have multilateral cooperation, and it's going to take a while to build up the network. But I think one of the reasons we set up this commission was to try to come up with some pretty uncontroversial and common sense basic norms that could be adopted, not just in Europe, but by India, in Latin America, even the Chinese and the Russians might adopt some of them. So, but it's accretive over time. What I don't think we're going to see is a big convention where everybody gets together. I know you had the GGE, that came up with some norms, but then that basically pardon? Talon manual, yeah, that's right. Again, is very helpful. The GGE came up with some norms, but then the Russians and the Chinese said they don't accept that international law applies. So it's a process. But I think if you went back to the early stages of the laws on warfare, that was also a bit of a process too.
Excellent. So there's a gentleman in the middle here.
Thank you. It's a very interesting presentation. I'm Jan Brevold from the Norwegian Socialist Left Party. I have two short questions. The first one is in regards to what actually constitutes critical infrastructure and supply side clearance, because in a world where far more items are connected to the network and far more items are influenced by the network, it seems hard to define what the actual borders between critical and not critical are. And my second question is in regards to deterrence, if you believe that it's or have some thoughts about if it's hard to make politicians or people in general think about this as an actual real threat without a physical example, visible physical example of the kind of damage that can be done.
Two good questions. So on the issue of where do you draw the line, as I said earlier, because of the Internet of Things, if you're an enterprise with critical infrastructure, you're going to be connected to all kinds of different things, including people who will want to use their own device to connect up with the network, and then they'll go home and they'll connect it up with their home device. So to me, I would look at critical infrastructure first by saying, what are the critical functions or effects we're trying to protect? Power, water, communications, things of that sort. Then the question is, how do you actually execute on that critical infrastructure protection, bearing in mind that not all elements of a power plant are equally critical? So, for example, some parts of it, like the customer billing stuff you have to do online, is important, but it's not going to cause the lights to go out if all of a sudden the bills don't go out quickly. So maybe you want to segregate that from the actual industrial control system that actually turns the turbines and does things of that sort. So to me, the critical infrastructure decision is first, what are the functions that are critical? Once you've done that, then the second order of issues is, okay, what elements in the functions need to be the highest value protection and what doesn't? On the issue of deterrence and coming up with a plan and also understanding when you would trigger deterrence. I would hate to think we're going to make that decision when something really bad happens. I thought NotPetya, because of what happened at Maersk, and there was a similar thing with the National Health Service in Britain, was starting to come close to something that people might say, whoa, this could really have an impact. My experience is that you don't want to wait until you actually have a 9/11 to figure out what you're going to do. So ideally, enough of us are running around saying, pay attention to this, that we can actually think through what are the red lines and what are the appropriate countermeasures without getting into the heat of battle where people tend to maybe overreact a little bit. I mean, to me, the biggest challenge here is because of the attribution issue, there's a lot of deniability. I mean, we built a whole deterrence structure on the nuclear age with the Soviet Union because everybody understood if we saw the planes taken off and they were coming across with bombs, there's no question whose planes they are. They've got red stars on them. That's not true with cyber. And you have to believe that a cyber attacker will continue to deny. So that creates the difficult issue. What level of certainty is enough? And that may vary depending on the response. And there's a lot of debate about what the right response is. So is the right response to election hacking, taking out a power plant? Probably not. Is it maybe financial sanctions? Could very well be. And then there's a whole separate issue about if we start to use financial sanctions a lot, are we going to bring the financial sector into the battlefield? And the adversary will say, okay, since you're going to make war using the banks, I'm going to attack the banks. So this is an area which takes a lot of subtlety. And that's why I'd like to think it through. To me, this is a big project. I'd like to think it through and debate it before we actually get into a situation where it triggers it. And I think this is a great area. I know NATO, Norway is participating in this thing with NATO on cyber. To me, apart from the technical and engineering aspects, the discussions of attribution and deterrence are the most important things that could come out of this. So everybody is on the same page about what is the threshold for each level of raising a response.
Before I open for more, I'd just like to follow up on that one. Isn't it? There's a counter argument here that this should deliberately be blurred, because if you draw the red line, they will just stop just beneath it.
You do want to blur the exact line, but you want to have a general approach on attribution, and certainly, I'm not saying you debate this open in the UN, but within NATO, there should be an understanding of what the NATO members and the NATO affiliates believe are the red lines and the appropriate responses.
If I may also, on the first question, I would like to follow up on the critical infrastructure, how to define it. Now, typically, we see that some countries ban, for instance, installation of Huawei because of the fear that, of course, they're controlled by the producer and the update can be controlled. But is that somewhat also a simplification? Because even on that kind of US-produced device will certainly have some components in it which is made somewhere else. So, so that in practice, you have the same problem with anything you buy, basically, because you don't have anything which is uniquely made in your own country in the US. So is that simplifying the...
Well, no, but that's actually a subject of big debate. So, for example, you're right. A lot of the chips and basic components are made elsewhere. And there's a move on in the U.S. now to actually say on certain critical functions, should we have a cradle-to-grave rule that we know who's making all the components from the chip level all the way up through the hardware and the software. Because there is a concern that you could have embedded within certain devices two problems. Either something that's got a backdoor or a flaw, or through the updating process, you could introduce something that would then become a backdoor and a flaw. You had this issue with Kaspersky, where the government came out and said, we're not going to use Kaspersky anymore, and that's a pretty big signal to the private sector that it's not particularly reliable. So,
it's not easy. All right, let's continue. Our friend up front here, just wait for a microphone.
it's okay.
No, we need it because it's streaming, so we need it. so the world can listen. Yep.
Valjar, Minister of Foreign Affairs, thank you for your presentation and being here. I heard interesting references to the Cold War, nuclear weapons, etc. And OSCE in Vienna had for sure a very important role with the confidence building measures work back then. US as well took a very important step engaging and taking initiative for confidence building measures also back in 2013 for cyber. How do you see the role from US or the OSCE for this work for future?
Yeah. I think it's an important point. I do think that we need to engage with adversaries even when we realize there are areas of disagreement, as we did during the Cold War. I know there was a U.S. government for a while was in discussion with the Russians, and then through the East-West Institute, I've participated somewhat in these track 1.5 things with the Russians, and I do believe there are some areas where the Russians and the NATO countries and the U.S. could reach some agreement because there's a recognition of mutual interest. There are some areas where I don't think we can reach an agreement, and that's, fine. I would like to see us, again, with a realistic sense of what is something that could be agreeable and what are things that are not going to be agreeable. I would like to see us continue that level of engagement. It has fallen off over the last several years, partly because of the election issues that have arisen, not just in the U.S., but here in Europe as well. And that's created a lot of mistrust and even irritation, which I think has made it a little difficult. But, as I said during the Cold War, one of the advantages of being a little older is you remember this. Even in the height of some of the really bad relations, we did engage with the Soviets and with the Chinese. And again, as long as you're clear-eyed about what you can reasonably expect, we could probably build confidence on a few things. For example, I think on the issue of, I use a biological example, the idea of a hotline, if something were to get out of the lab, so to speak, and you wanted to warn your, person on the other side, hey, look, something escaped from the lab, you may want to look out for it, and here's what you do about it. Things like that I don't think really hurt either side, and they do reduce the level of tension. So a realistic engagement would be a desirable thing.
Oh, I still have a hotline between our military headquarters and the rest of the fleet.
Yeah.
All right, please.
Asbjørn Ueland, Petroleum Safety Authority. Very interesting to hear your view on critical infrastructure. As responsible for that, I have a question regarding insider. In discussion of physical infrastructure, we discuss insider quite a lot, but I don't see that much in cyber. Of course, we have the unintended insiders. You mentioned USB sticks, but what are your thoughts about real insiders?
Yeah,
in cyber?
that is a really serious issue, and we've seen a number of examples recently, and even in the U.S. government, where individuals use their inside access to steal a lot of things. And there's no reason to believe that insiders, particularly these days where you have people who are, all kinds of ideological radicals on every side, someone deciding they want to take action on the inside. And that's an area where, to be honest, I think there's been less attention paid than should. I know one thing we do in our counseling practice is focus on the issue of how do you deal with the insider question. Some of it has to do with who has privileges, who has administrative privileges, who has access to certain things. Because the more people who have access, the more your worry is. And then there are certain things you can do on the network that will begin to tell you when someone is doing something that suggests they may be either stealing something or planting something. And this kind of behavioral analytic capability is, to my mind, something we talk about as a critical part of dealing with insiders. If someone is doing things on the network that don't make sense in terms of what their job description is or their past pattern is, there may be an innocent reason for that, but you ought to pay attention. So I think that this is, whether it's vetting who gets access, carefully controlling privileges and identification, monitoring what is going on in the network, and then taking that data and measuring it using behavioral analytics. I think those are 4 elements of an absolutely indispensable insider threat program.
Waiting for another question. I wonder, in cases where the private sector have a lower security standard than the public sector, in the sense that the public sector expects you to use components, for instance, that are more expensive for security reasons, and they don't think, from their business point of view, you don't need it. In the U.S., who pays? Is the public sector paying that difference, or are they just by law enforcing the companies?
No, I mean the U.S. government pays. If it's going to cost more, the government pays more. Now, if the government's buying in bulk, they may get a discount because of that. The real issue is the private sector sometimes says the government should pay for our security. I think the government's view is no, we don't pay for the lock on your door. We don't pay for your accountants. But that's coming back to the liability system. If you treat cybersecurity as something that's an element of your insurance premium, then you create a financial incentive for companies to invest because they get a lower premium and they get better insurance.
That's something we should take note of. I don't think we had that in Norway, do we? Okay, sir, it's over there, front row, second row.
Thank you for an interesting lecture. My name is Kjetil Hansen. I'm a journalist in newspaper here, Aftenposten. You mentioned the election hack of 2016. Now, you have a president who doesn't seem too enthusiastic about the investigation of that. What is your opinion?
So there are two. I want to be careful to distinguish between 2 parts of the election issue. One is actually the risk of hacking into a database or a voting machine. Voting machines are tricky to hack into because they tend not to be connected at the time of voting. There was indication there was malware found in voter registration databases in various states. I don't know that anybody concluded that anything destructive happened, but I do think that there's now, at least I was told over the summer by Homeland Security, that they're working with all of the states now on upgrading the level of protection for that infrastructure. And that's still a work in progress, but I think everybody is focused on this. And there is an element of Homeland Security that is working with the private sector on this. The second part of the election, which frankly gets more attention, but is strictly speaking not a cybersecurity issue, is the manipulation of social media or information operations. So I'm going to go back to the Cold War. Guess what, folks? This is not new. 100 years ago, the Comintern was out trying to foment disorder, revolution, putting out what we call fake news, but they call propaganda. Now, they weren't very good at it, but the strategy is very old and venerable. What's changed is the media, which can be used to generate social disorder and dissension, have become much more sophisticated. And to be honest, our societies in the West, there's much more mistrust of the so-called mainstream media, and that opens an opportunity for all kinds of conspiracy theories and weird things to get out there. And what the Russians do is they take advantage of it. And it's not just at the election, they'll foment both sides of it. So I know the Department of Homeland Security now is setting up a program on trying to help identify and push back against these kinds of information operations. This, however, is an area where we have to be delicate because, on the one hand, again, this is a personal view, I think it's completely appropriate to identify and shut down botnets that generate artificial traffic, or to forbid people from pretending to be somebody else so they can friend people, or requiring that if a foreigner wants to do a campaign spot, they can't do it because we don't allow foreigners to do that, requiring people to identify themselves. There are a whole lot of things I think that can be done. I get nervous when we talk about the government actually getting into the content, because at least in the US, where we have a First Amendment, although there's some content that can be regulated, it's very narrow. Things like incitement, conspiracy, defamation, child pornography. But generally, even obnoxious ideas, in the U.S. it's protected by the First Amendment. So, but I do think the Department of Homeland Security, Department of State are beginning to now mount an effort to work with the private sector and other government agencies to at least identify and call out these efforts to subvert and do propaganda. NATO has a strategic communications office or arm. My sense is that until recently, that was viewed as a relic of the Cold War. I think it's all of a sudden people have woken up and realized, well, we better revive this. And I think it's got to be retooled for the 21st century. But the last thing to come back to what was said earlier is this is what education is about. In the end, if you want to counteract some of the nonsense conspiracy stuff you see on the internet, which is, really nuts, you got to teach people how to tell what's true and what's not true. And that starts in grade school. Critical thinking. Does this make sense? Is only one person saying it, or are other people saying it? Is there any external validation? This is, by the way, about to get worse for the following reason. There is a capability which some people call deep fakes, which is and I saw a demonstration of this when we were doing our election commission thing, where they can actually take an image of a person and make it appear that the person and their voice are saying something, and it's completely fabricated. It's like photoshopping in video and audio. It's not as easy as it sounds, particularly the audio piece is a little tricky, and matching it up is a little tricky, but I'm quite sure within a matter of 2 or 3 years, we're going to have deep fakes that are undetectable. That's a technology issue, and one of the things we're going to look at in the commission I'm doing with Anders Rasmussen, is there a way to watermark photos or audio clips so you can determine whether something's real or not? Are there intrinsic things that can be looked at in terms of the actual digital content of a clip to determine if it's real or not? But, we could easily get to a point where you can't believe your own eyes. So, this problem is not going away, and it's not unique to, the Russians and Chinese. You could get it from, extreme groups on the right or the left. All kinds of craziness. So this is a lot about inoculating people.
In your speech, you mentioned that it's difficult for private sector sometimes to know how much they need to do themselves. And I think I recognize that from talking to private sector here in Norway. They had a responsibility as to defend their own systems, but how much do they need? What is required? And it's, of course, confusion around that. And there's no silver bullet, no clear answer. And the solution is often some kind of a hub, so information sharing. So you mentioned some initiatives in the US. Now, of course, the US is somewhat maybe different from other European countries, but I'm sure you work with European countries as well. So I just wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on solutions, because this is not fixed by law. This is about information sharing and building trust and finding creative platforms or portals or some way, and maybe not on a classified level, even because you cannot have everybody classified. So are there other solutions and ideas to see out there that we could learn from in Norway?
Yeah, I think that we could have a whole session in itself about what is the right approach, soup to nuts, in terms of securing your enterprise. On the issue of sharing, though, I think part of this is it's relationship building, which is true in the government too. I found when I was in government, if I was dealing with people from different agencies over time, you build a relationship. So some of it is creating the infrastructure, platforms, even co-locating people so they share in real time. But part of it is doing it a lot. The more you do it, the more you have confidence in each other. So what I would do, and I think they're doing in the financial sector in particular, is very advanced, and also the utilities. The major players do get together and they do discuss these cyber things. The government often convenes them. and they meet each other, and then when something happens, they know who to call or who to contact right away. And ideally, you want to be linked up in a way that allows you to share in real time the examples of malware that you're seeing or behavior on the network that seems a little odd. So it's really, it's like a team sport. The more you're out in the field, playing, the better you are.
Exercises is often mentioned. That's very important. They said, as in any security measure, cybersecurity exercises. Do you do that in the US a lot?
Yeah, we do that. We've done some with the electric utilities in the U.S. And with the financial sector, and I think more and more companies are seeing that there's value in doing that because they almost always discover that they didn't think of something, or they thought they had a capability they don't have, or there's a vulnerability that they didn't think about. So it's a way of testing. And I think, and even penetration testing. We did a project for a company that had quite good security, but what we did is we sent some people into the lobby of the building, and they said they were here to meet XYZ. Fine, the receptionist said you can sit down there. They opened up their laptops, and it was unpassword protected Wi-Fi in the building, so they sucked down all this data that was floating around the building. The people in the company had never thought about that as a vulnerability. That's why testing and exercising is critical.
All right, we have a few more minutes if there are any other questions burning. Stuart, you want another one, another shot? And it's Lars. Well, Lars first then, because he hadn't had a chance yet, and I will give it to you.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. My name is Lars Jesvik. I'm a researcher here at NUPI. I have two questions. The first, you mentioned NotPetya, and of course, there's another side to the story, which is the vulnerability and how that came to be discovered and stolen and shared. So I wanted to ask you, do you have any idea about vulnerability disclosures between allies? Or is this something that every state needs to build, create the capacities to do on their own? My second question is related to deterrence. You talked about the importance of building acceptance for red lines and thresholds when it comes to cyber war. Now, different states have quite different cultural conceptions of what constitutes cyber war. So I wanted to ask you, would you want to comment on how that impacts or limits the ability of having deterrence when states doesn't really agree on what cyber war is and what it looks like?
Yeah. So as to the first question, as I said earlier, we have in the U.S. a vulnerabilities equity process. What we're supposed to do is look at a particular vulnerability and decide, is this widespread and something that we have to disclose, or is it sufficiently narrow and unavailable that we can hold it for our own use but not disclose it? I think actually, again, should be a presumption of disclosure that you do disclose. And I certainly think among allies, there should be a presumption of disclosure, although we're really talking about disclosing to the companies that patch it. So this is one where collective activity is much better than individual activity. On the second question of warfare, so I take a pretty narrow view, and I can't say I've got a fixed solution, but to me, when people die, that's pretty clearly warfare. So if you were to unplug all the hospitals, and 10,000 people died, I don't think people are going to have a lot of trouble figuring out if that's war or not. Now, then you get to the harder question: who did it? And like with Estonia in 2007, the Russians said, "Oh, it was just patriotic hackers." The problem of deniability is much greater in cyberspace than it is in the physical world. And to me, that's the harder question. Do you require attribution beyond a reasonable doubt, like you would in a courtroom, or is it 51% certainty, or somewhere in between? And I don't claim to have an answer for that. But I do think it's something we have to discuss. Now, my intuition is there are two factors that will come into play on that issue. One is the seriousness of the attack. If, to be honest, the more serious the attack, the lower the attribution threshold will be, to a point. And the second thing is the government, and this goes to why the government does legitimately want to keep secrets. Sometimes the government will have a look at something in someone else's toolbox that actually would settle the question. And if you're going to make a decision to go to war, if I was the decision maker, I'd want to look at that before I made a final decision. But that might well be enough to put me into the category of certainty. So I think that's the kind of subtle discussion that we're going to have to have.
Yeah, may I follow up on that? Because attribution, all the major attacks we've seen in the world, we kind of know.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe there's patriotic hackers, but we know it from Russia. If there were any big attack, we kind of actually have attributed. And it doesn't come out of the blue. It's usually in the political context of a conflict anyway, like in Ukraine, Russia.
Yeah.
So, is it really a big problem?
But we kind of know. The question is, how much do you have to know to actually do something serious in response? Like, if you want to just name and shame somebody, that's not a very high threshold. But if you're going to, if you had a major incident and loss of life, and you were going to talk about doing something to really damage another country, kind of know would not do it. Then the question is, what would you have to say publicly in order to make that case? Look, remember the Iraq War? There was a whole discussion about what does the government have to show, U.S. government have to show to go into Iraq? And that's still a matter that is hotly debated. You could walk away from that experience and saying, unless you have 100% positive certainty that you can say that this came from country X, you can't do anything. That is a very narrow area of deterrence. On the other hand, if you take a broader view, there's every chance that down the line you're going to get another replay of the stuff that we heard after Iraq. Don't underestimate, that had a huge impact on the way people think about the justification for engaging in conflict. But there again, the more serious the damage, the lower the threshold is going to be. If there was a 9/11, I think there'd be a willingness to be a little more aggressive if I hate to put it this way, if you could still see the bodies smoldering. So that's the realistic issue. But I come back to my earlier point. While you can't guarantee what's going to happen in a crisis, the more you think it through before, the more likely you will come up with a better response.
Grant, if you another one.
I don't want to defend, please. This is something I've been cut down in academic circles and in political circles when I suggested it many times at different conferences. I believe that we need and we should be pushing for an international court of cyber attribution, the same way we want of crimes against humanity. Of course, the United States has a certain opinion on that too, because exactly it come down. But so that's a specific question. Should we be fighting as a small nation? Because it's the small nations that use the international courts when it comes to attribution. You guys are going to figure out attribution anyways, but we're the ones that are going to have to be able to use this. We saw that. So should we be pushing for an international court of cyber attribution?
I'm not sure that the courtroom. I used to be a judge. I spent a lot of years trying cases as a prosecutor and defense attorney. So I love the courts. I'm not sure the courts are the best thing for settling everything, but there has been discussion about having a kind of an attribution panel, probably actually mostly the private sector, that would be international, they couldn't adjudicate things, but they would be able to issue reports that would lay out the case for attributing a particular thing to a particular country. Yeah, and the advantage of that would be it would be, more broadly based and international. They wouldn't have government power, but they would have a lot of technical ability. It also, I think that some of the individual companies that have sometimes made attributions, they've sometimes found themselves under attack. So there would be some safety in bringing a group of them together and white labeling the results. So no one company would be the focus of being kind of harassed. So I do think there's value to that.
But this company, you call them Blue Fire or something, right?
Right, Blue Fire, yeah.
Blue and Fire. I mean, they also, of course, it's a business model for them. It's good. I mean, to be the one who name and shame, like, you know, they gain customers from it. So they have a business interest also, which could be in a negative in a way, maybe be too trigger happy in attribution because it kind of gives them credibility.
Yeah, although if you balance it with enough entities, the chances are that it's not worth it for anybody to really try to monkey around with it. Because, you know, they're going to get the country that gets named, they're going to get some pushback from. But I do think that companies have a pretty strong interest, given that they're global, in maintaining trust. Because if they lose trust, their business is done.
Yep.
So that's a pretty strong positive incentive.
That's basically, yes. All right. Any other last questions? We have 1 more minute. Okay. One more last from our Republicans abroad. And then we will close.
Hi, I just wondered about something. I noticed at the beginning of your talk that a lot of it was government influence over the internet. And while in Europe that's kind of a thing, they're kind of used to government oversight over just about everything. When it comes to the United States and probably the world better, do you see it, the military or governmental influence escalating? Will there be more government regulation or less government regulations once you get a handle on national cyber attacks?
Well, I don't. So first of all, I think I thought what I said when we started out was I was talking about public-private partnerships. What does the government do? What does the private sector do? Because the complaint I most often hear in the U.S. is how come the government's not doing more to protect us? You know, we pay for a military, we pay for a Defense Department. Shouldn't they defend us? Why do we have to defend ourselves? So, I mean, that's actually the complaint I hear in the U.S. is the government's not doing enough. I don't think the government ought to be on the internet. I don't think the government ought to be on everybody's networks. Regulation is a little different. Regulation is about creating incentives for the private sector to do things, rewards and penalties. And I think there probably is a role for the government to work in setting standards for cybersecurity. So, like, here's a good example. Like when I go, with rare exceptions, a little more these days maybe, when I go into the grocery store, I'm highly confident that the food I buy is not going to make me sick because there's a Food and Drug Administration that sets rules up. And when there is a contamination of, like lettuce, as we've had recently, they're pretty quick about shutting it down, requiring all that stuff to be sent back, and then fixing where the problem came from. Now, that's government regulation, but it's really beneficial to the private sector because if every time you walked into the grocery store you didn't know if you're going to get poisoned, you would stop going to the grocery store, you'd grow your own food, and that would be just the end of the grocery business. The internet's a little bit of the same thing. If it becomes the Wild West, people are going to stop using it. So ideally, smart regulation gets the private sector the right set of incentives to do the job of making sure that the internet is, relatively speaking, safe and trustworthy, which is the indispensable requirement for having it function the way I think people would like it to function.
All right. Well, Mr. Chertoff, it's been an honor to have you here and listen to you. These are complicated issues.
Yeah.
You describe it in a very, very eloquent way. I think we all understood it. And that's very useful because it's a debate that needs to be taken further on also in Norway. As I mentioned, the parliamentarians are discussing today the security of the 20th century. They should discuss the security of the future, which is what we discussed today. So let's
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.